And if you could open up your Bibles with me this morning to Matthew 15. Matthew 15, starting in verse 21, as we continue our study in the book of Matthew. And Pastor Brandon mentioned it, so of course I have to bring it up as well. Today is St. Patrick's Day, and Pastor Brandon mentioned if you're not wearing green, you get pinched. And I couldn't help but revert back to my childhood in that my grandfather immigrated from Northern Ireland. And I didn't really know that grandfather because he died when I was super young. Apparently, fighting in a world war as well as working in a factory that's infested with asbestos has some kind of impact on your lungs and causes you to pass away early. But I remember as a kid, I'd go out, obviously with my parents, and people would say things to my dad like, "Hey, you're not wearing green today." And his response was always the same every single year. And he would say, "I'm not wearing green today because I'm not Catholic today." Because if you look at the Irish flag for Southern Ireland, there is orange at the top, green at the bottom, and white in the middle. And the orange represents Northern Ireland, which is for Protestants. And so he would say, well, if I was going to dress up for St. Patrick's Day, it would be orange. Down at the bottom is green, which stands for the identification with Roman Catholicism. And in the middle is white, which stands for unity and the hope that Southern Ireland has that one day both Northern and Southern Ireland will once again be unified, which is very unlikely. But that's what it stands for. And so all of us here this morning, just like good independent Baptists, are neither wearing green or orange. So you're right in character. But let's turn this morning to Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 21. If I were to ask you this morning, where do you think the most unlikely place to find $10 million would be? I know what my answer is. And if you're somebody that thinks like me, probably the most unlikely place to find $10 million is in my own bank account, right? That's exactly what Lisa was. Is that exactly what you were thinking? And this is probably what one California couple thought one day when they decided to take their dog for a walk. And while doing so, they were walking in their backyard and they discovered that there was an old rusty can kind of sticking out of the ground in their backyard. And so just like any good homeowner, they stooped down, they picked up that rusty can, kind of unburied it, unearthed it, and soon discovered, hey, there are some gold coins in here. And they continued just like anybody else would, right? They're like, if there's one can of gold coins, I wonder if there's more. And so they started digging up their yard. And what they discovered is that they found multiple cans filled with gold coins. Some were $20 gold coins, some were $10 gold coins, some were $5 gold coins. There was one gold coin that was valued at up to $1 million all by itself. And at the end of the day, they discovered buried in their backyard, the most unlikely of all places to find hidden treasure, right? Your own backyard. They discovered about $10 million worth of antique gold coins in their own backyard. Now, that seems very unlikely, but it happened. As we come to our text this morning, I would imagine that that's exactly what the disciples were feeling when they came to this point in Jesus' ministry. They had traveled with Jesus all over Israel, and they had seen some of the most influential religious leaders reject Jesus, people in whom you would expect to find the most faith. They found the least faith, only to have Jesus commend the faith of what we'll see this morning, the faith of what seemed to them to be a random Canaanite woman in the most unlikely of all places, which is, in the Jewish mind, outside of Israel. So let's turn our attention this morning to Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 21. And it says, "Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed.' But he answered her, not a word. His disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and to throw it to the little dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And first, as we get started this morning, if we could go to the next slide, which is a picture of a map, we'll find that I've plotted out some of the places in which Jesus did ministry. And we see in Matthew chapter 14 that this pinpoint is about where Jesus was doing ministry at the time of the beheading of John the Baptist. And as you would anticipate, this caused Jesus to kind of leave that region. And so if we could go to the next map slide there, you'll see that Jesus moved up to the region of Galilee. And as we approach this text, Matthew is interesting. Pastor Brennan and I were talking about this yesterday, and that Matthew, pretty much everything he communicates, he organizes either chronologically, geographically, and all the stories are organized. Even his grammar, we'll see this morning, is organized in such a way as that he's trying to communicate something. So John the Baptist is beheaded. Jesus, of course, flees that region, not out of fear, but out of the fact that they had rejected John the Baptist's ministry, which means that, of course, they'd also reject Jesus. So Jesus went to minister in the region of Galilee. And then we see the feeding of the 5,000 also in Matthew chapter 14. And at that time, they, according to John chapter 6 and verse 15, that they were coming to take Jesus by force in order to make him king. And if we could go to the next slide there, we'll see that it's at this point that Jesus sends his disciples over to the other side of the sea, and that Jesus goes and he walks on water. Pastor Brandon spoke about this just a couple weeks ago. And Jesus walks on the water out to them. They then journey to the other side. And then if we could go to the next slide, Jesus makes it to the other side. And according to Matthew chapter 6, when they make it to the other side, there is a group of Jews that meet them there. And of course, they had just experienced the feeding of the 5,000 and they wanted to be fed again. And they are trying to get Jesus to multiply bread again in order that they would have food to eat. And they begin to kind of antagonize Jesus, not in a way that they would make him angry, but in a way that they thought that he would produce bread for them. And they begin to question him and say things like, "Hey, if you're really from God, maybe you could not just multiply bread once, but maybe you could do it twice." And what Jesus says to them is that, you know what? That's not the greatest work that God is going to do for you. Actually, the greatest work that God can do and that you can perform, because they directly ask him this question, how can we do the works of God? And he says, this is the work of God, that you would believe in him whom God has sent. And then Jesus proceeds to heal some other people in that area. And if we could go to the next slide. Then he debates over tradition with the elders. And Jesus had just finished saying, right, to this group, that if you want to do the works of God, the greatest of all the works of God is that you would believe in him whom God has sent. And yet, these scribes and these elders and these Pharisees, what they were so hung up on was the fact that Jesus did not hold to their tradition. And if we could then go to the last one, then Jesus goes up to this area, which is kind of a large geographic area, the area of Tyre and Sidon. But again, Matthew makes this for a point, and we'll discover it later. But then he goes up to this region in order to heal the Canaanite woman's daughter. If we go to the next one, this is a map of all of the places that Jesus ministered. And I know it's too small for you to see, but if you were to zoom in, you would see that the areas that we previously had highlighted are the areas that would be recognized as Israel proper. And out of all the places and all the people that Jesus ministered to during his ministry, he leaves Israel to minister one time. Outside of Israel to someone who is not Jewish. Now, that is not to say that he did not minister to other Gentiles. That is clear. He obviously did. He healed the demon-possessed man at Gadara. He healed the centurion's daughter. He obviously ministered and worked with and helped Gentiles. But geographically, this is the only, or one of the only times that Jesus leaves Israel proper in order to do ministry. And Jesus, I believe, in this, because Matthew also makes this point, by the time that Jesus goes to feed the 5,000, he is beginning to separate himself from the crowds and dedicate himself to his disciples. And they were unable to get any breathing room in Israel for Jesus to be able to do that. But interestingly, even though you might think that the only reason that Jesus is leaving Israel is to get some breathing room to minister to his disciples, he ministers to this woman and then goes right back to Galilee. And that's it. That's what Matthew records for us. And this is Jesus working with his disciples that they would understand something that has always been true about God, and that is that God has a heart to minister and save all people, and that he would accomplish that mission through the people of Israel. And all this is super important when it comes to understanding this passage. Otherwise, if you don't understand these things, his interaction with this woman is very awkward and strange. But Jesus, just as he promised to Abraham that he would bless all the nations of the earth through him, and just as a mixed multitude went up with them also in the Exodus, and flocks and herds and a great deal of livestock, according to Exodus 12:38, just as Egyptians who believed in the God of Israel and left and turned their back on Egypt and left with the Israelites, just as they were saved, and just as women like this Canaanite woman, like Rahab and Ruth, just as they were saved, God was preparing his disciples to minister to Gentiles once the Jews would reject the gospel of Jesus. And so Jesus goes and he leaves Israel to find faith in the most unlikely of all places, at least in the Jewish mind, and that is outside of Israel, to a random Canaanite woman. So first, let's look at the first section of this passage, Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 21 down to 24. It says, "Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan from that region cried out to him, saying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed.' But he answered her not a word. His disciples came and urged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she cries out after us.' And he answered and said, 'I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.'" And so as Jesus and his disciples come to the region of Tyre and Sidon, they entered a house, and once again they were hoping for some rest. Mark chapter 7 and verse 24 actually gives us a little additional detail here. It says that when they left and they went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, that he entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. That this woman was intent on finding Jesus. She had a need, and she had faith that Jesus was the only one that could meet her need. And so Jesus, wanting to spend time with his disciples, actually leaves Israel and does not want it to be known, but she is so full of faith and so intent on finding Jesus, and Jesus is so much different than any other person, right? That she turns over every rock that she knows in order to find Jesus. Jesus is no ordinary man. He cannot be hidden. And she finds him because her faith was dependent on him. And so first of all, we see that great faith is dependent. and is dependent on God and what we believe he can do. And she was desperate, turning over every rock imaginable to find Jesus. And she had reason to be desperate. As we look into this passage, behold, a woman of Canaan from that region cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me." Why? "My daughter is severely demon-possessed." Because as we look throughout the New Testament, demon possession carries with it some hefty and significant symptoms that this woman would have been desperate to see her daughter, whom she loves, get rid of. Symptoms such as violent convulsions, as self-harm, as being unexplainably mute, deaf, random seizures, foaming of the mouth, gnashing of teeth, being unexplainably blind and mute. And she, her daughter, could have had all of these symptoms, some of these symptoms, any combination of these symptoms. But if there's anything that we understand from the New Testament, it is that demon possession is not something to laugh at. It is something to seek God for. That God is the only one that can rid a heart from an evil spirit that would cause these physical and spiritual ramifications. And so she witnessed her daughter, whom she loved, being tortured day in and day out by demon possession. So it is of no wonder, right, moms, that she was desperate. It's also interesting that Matthew is like super honed in on like every detail. It's interesting that Matthew also refers to her as a Canaanite woman. It's interesting because that's the only time that Canaanite is used in the New Testament. And when you hear the word Canaanite, you automatically go to the Old Testament, in which, in the Old Testament ideology, the imagery is that Canaanites worship false gods. They are identified with the gods of this world. While the Jews, they were supposed to, right? They didn't always worship God the way they should, but they were supposed to be identified with the true God. And so Matthew, identifying her as a Canaanite woman, draws a direct line between her and her worship of false gods. And she likely was a worshiper, a former worshiper anyway, of false gods. In particular, being from this region and having the culture that she had, she was most likely the worshiper of the false god Astarte, which was the female counterpart to Baal. So she was basically a Baal worshiper. And she had likely, when she began to see the signs of her daughter being tortured day in and day out by these demonic spirits, probably went first to her own gods. And you begin to draw the line of what Matthew is saying. She went to her own gods, and she begged her gods that her daughter would be delivered from this evil spirit. And she heard nothing back, because those gods do not exist. And you begin to be reminded of Elijah in his face-off with the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. That Baal is the God that cannot hear, while God is the God that can. And so she was desperate because she saw her daughter being tortured. She was desperate because she had already begged her gods, and her gods could not hear her. However, she had heard of Jesus, this man from Israel who healed. And she knew that the Jews believed that one day God would send a Messiah to the people of Israel, and she had heard of his kindness and his mercy to others. Perhaps she had even heard of how he healed Gentiles like her. And one thing was clear: Jesus could hear, while her gods could not. And in her desperation, she seeks out Jesus and she finds him. And of course, when she finds him, all she has to say is, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But I want you to notice the next words that are in verse 23. But he answered her not a word. Now imagine being this woman and you have already prayed to your gods. Nothing. But you know, you've heard about this Jesus. And you know that he has healed other Gentiles. You know that the Jews say about him that everywhere he goes, he heals all kinds of people. This is why crowds follow him everywhere. That's why he can't go to from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other side without everybody going all the way around to meet him on the other side. Because he hears and he heals. She had already sought for all the answers in all the wrong places and heard nothing. And she stands before the only one that she now recognizes can help her. And she says, "Have mercy on me." And what she hears in return is silence. What would you be thinking in that moment? Because if Jesus won't answer, no one will. The early church father Chrysostom wrote concerning this moment, it was as if the word had no word. It was as if the fountain was sealed. It was as if the physician held back his remedy. You know, one of the things that I hate more than anything else, one of my biggest pet peeves is being ignored. But imagine being ignored when you're desperate. You know, by all indications, this woman had limited theological knowledge. But the ironic thing is with her limited theological knowledge, she displayed great faith. Because even when Jesus was silent, she would not stop asking. She continued to cry out for mercy. She understood better than what the Jews should have understood. Even if it was instinctive based on her faith that who Jesus was, she understood what it says in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, that the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. You know, a lot of people in this world, when they think about Christianity and the God that we worship, they often only think about judgment and the harsh sides of what we believe. But when God presents himself to the people of Israel, the first thing he says is that I am God, merciful and gracious. Now, of course, if you keep reading Exodus 34, if you bypass his mercy and grace, then comes judgment, right? But first, you are encountered with God's mercy and grace. And she understands this in her limited theological knowledge. She was wholeheartedly confident that Jesus is the one that is the God of mercy and grace. And so she places all of her faith entirely in Christ alone, everything in. She's not going anywhere until Jesus hears. And so undaunted by the silence, she continues to cry out for mercy to the point where the disciples came to Jesus and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." You know, I wonder what the disciples were thinking when all of this was going on. And I'm sure there was several moments, and who knows how long it was that she was crying out and Jesus was not responding. And eventually the disciples respond. And they say, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." And when the disciples come to Jesus and say this to Jesus, what they're saying is, Jesus, she continues to cry out after us, despite the fact that you're not responding. And I'm sure there was some time in between, because the disciples had already witnessed Jesus heal Gentiles. And they were probably thinking, hey, Jesus is going to heal her and then send her on her way. Jesus is going to fix her problem and then send her on her way. But after some time, and Jesus saying nothing, they say, Jesus, send her away, for she cries out after us. We know that this at least is how Jesus understands it. Jesus understands that when the disciples come to him and say this, that what they're asking Jesus to do is, Jesus, heal her so she'll stop crying and she'll leave. And we know that Jesus understands it this way because he then responds, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he's communicating to his disciples, I know why I'm here, sent from God. It is to minister to the Jews, to the house of Israel. That's why I'm here. And that's why I'm being silent, at least for now. Jesus understands that that's what they want, and the disciples, I'm sure, were confused. So despite Israel's rejection of Jesus, God's plan for the redemption of Israel was still on track. The Lord was and is always going to keep his promises to Israel. We're reminded of this even after this incident in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first. That's always been true. However, it has always also been true, according to Genesis chapter 26 and verse 4, his promise that he made to Abraham, that I will make of your descendants to multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all of the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So both of these things are true. All of the nations are to be blessed through Israel, but Jesus is there primarily to minister to the house of Israel. Salvation is for everyone, but it's offered through Israel's Messiah, which is Jesus. But yet this woman was still there, and she still was placing all of her faith on Jesus, and she knew that he alone could help her daughter. And although it seemed like Jesus might not answer her, although it seemed like at this point when Jesus says, I'm not here for that, I'm here to minister to the house of Israel, although it seems that Jesus might not even be for her, she persisted in her faith and reveals to us the second aspect of great faith, which is that great faith endures. Despite the fact that she didn't know what the end result would be, she persisted in asking. After what must have seemed like a devastating rejection, she came and worshiped him. In fact, she doubled down on her worship of him. Let's take a look at verse 25. Then she came and worshiped him, saying, Lord, help me. The word worship could be better translated prostrated. She literally came and threw herself down on the ground before Jesus. Her faith did more than endure, it doubled down. I'm not here for that, and yet she still believes that he will hear and that he will act. And simply prostrates herself before him and says the only thing she knows how to say as a desperate mom, Lord, help me. Jesus was her only hope. And again, he says, let's take a look at verse 26. But he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. Now to us, that seems a little off-putting. And kind of it is. But she understands, as we'll see, what Jesus means. And Jesus is purposefully using these words, but in a playful way with the disciples. Is Jesus against her? And is Jesus giving some kind of racial slur against her? No, that's not the case. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. However, what Jesus is pointing out to the disciples, before we get to what Jesus' intent is, what Jesus is pointing out to them is that, hey, you Jews have always considered Gentiles to be nothing but dirty dogs. What do you think? Should I help her? Because I also want you to notice that Matthew, even in his grammar, is purposeful. Jesus answers, but when Matthew chooses his words, there is no object to Jesus' answering. In other words, Jesus is not answering her specifically. Jesus is not really answering anyone specifically. He's just making statements. I'm not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Should I take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs? He's challenging the disciples' belief system. Should I, Jesus playfully asks, help this person whom you Jews consider to be dogs? And I'm sure this woman heard this language before, but Jesus didn't say it in the way that the Jews did, because even in Jesus communicating that to his disciples, did carefully choose his words as well. If we go to the next slide, in the New Testament, there are 2 words for dog. The word dog in the New Testament appears 9 times. 5 times the Greek word for dog is the word kuon. And it is this word here, and if we could show that first picture there, this is what is meant by the word kuon. Now, I couldn't find like an actual picture that would depict everything that this word would mean, but this is what the Jews would use. This is the word that the Jews would use in reference to Gentiles. And as you notice, does that dog look friendly? No. The word that the Jews would use for dogs when referring to Gentiles was in reference specifically to dogs who were mean, who were vicious, who were dirty, who were flea-ridden, and were good for nothing to be left in the street. That's what the Jews meant when they used this word. But there's a second word, and it's only used 4 times in the New Testament. It's used twice in this passage, and it's used twice in this passage's parallel passage. In other words, it's only ever used in this instance. This is the only time. If we could show that next picture, this is what Jesus is saying in reference to her. He's saying, I don't consider you to be a dirty, mangy, nasty dog. The word that Jesus chooses is little, household, beloved pet. In other words, what Jesus is saying is he's not saying that he considers her to be a dirty dog. What he's saying is he considers her to be a part of the household, but just not the primary part of the household, right? Hopefully any of you guys that have dogs love your dogs, right? And you feed your dogs on a regular basis. You walk your dogs, you bathe your dogs, you take care of your dogs. But if given the choice, would you starve your kids to save the dog? And the answer is obviously no. And again, Jesus' primary point is not that he doesn't love her, but that she's not the primary purpose. And he challenges the belief of the disciples, but also thinking it from her perspective. Think about what she must be feeling at this moment. Lord, help me. Silence. Lord, help me. I'm not sent for that. Lord, help me. Is it appropriate even, Jesus challenges, to take what is meant for Israel and to give it to the Gentiles? At this moment, how would you be feeling? I'm going to be honest, if it were me and the well-being of someone I loved was on the line, I'm not sure how well I'd be doing. It seemed as if Jesus was purposefully and knowingly ignoring her. Notice that he hasn't answered her at all up to this point. As we already observed, Matthew purposefully leaves out any object to the word answer. Jesus is just making statements. Jesus has seemingly completely ignored this woman, and you might expect her to begin saying things like, listen, Jesus, I have prayed to my gods, and they cannot answer me. So I sought you out, Jesus. I sought you out because I've heard of your mercy and kindness. I heard that you healed the demon-possessed man in Gadara. I heard that you helped the centurion. I've heard that you've helped these other Gentiles. I know you can answer me, but it seems as if you're not. It is said, Jesus, that you go everywhere, healing everyone in Israel, and some in my country wonder whether or not there will ever be anyone sick in Israel again left when you're finished. So Jesus, why not me? Why not help my little girl? That's what you'd expect. That's not what she does. Let's take a look The next verse, and she said, "Yes, Lord, yet not even the little dogs eat the crumbs. Yet, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." She doesn't respond that way. This woman's faith does not falter like any good mom. She picks up on exactly what Jesus means and applies it exactly to her situation so that her daughter could see the benefit. She understands Jesus' metaphor, and she immediately picks it up and she concludes it. Jesus, I think, leaves it open to kind of test the disciples, but she, in her great faith, finishes the metaphor. She says, "Yes, but even the little dogs benefit from the crumbs which fall from the master's table." And this is something that she picked up on that the disciples had only begun to understand. It's very similar to Peter's statement in John chapter 6, verses 67 to 68, where Jesus says to them, "Do you want to also go away?" This is right after Jesus told the multitudes that chased him after the feeding of the 5,000. They said, "Jesus, provide for us more bread." Jesus says, to paraphrase and shorten it, "No." They leave. And Jesus asks, "Will you leave also?" And Peter says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And this is what this woman is saying. She's saying, "Yes, that's true, Jesus. You're not here primarily for us Gentiles, but there's nowhere else for me to go. So, I will be satisfied with just a crumb that Israel doesn't even want." Yes, Lord, I know your coming is for Israel. God's covenants are with Israel. They are with the children of Abraham. But even the beloved household pet can enjoy the crumbs which fall from the master's table. I know who you are. I know of your mercy, your kindness, and your power. And she is making the statement that I am 100% confident that just a small, unwanted leftover is all I need to help me and my daughter. And that's all I'm asking for, a moment. And in a passage filled with silence, this is the moment that this passage has been working towards. Jesus, this whole time, has been making statements kind of directed at no one. And it's in this moment that he then turns his attention directly to her. And I can't help but imagine that as he does this, he's making eye contact with all the disciples, saying to them, "I hope you're taking notes here." Because this woman has faith. And then his attention rests on her for the first time. For the first time, this woman is seen. For the first time, this woman is heard. This time, Jesus says to her, then Jesus answered in verse 28 and said to her, and again, Matthew's very purposeful. Jesus answered, no object. Jesus answered, no object. This last time, though, Jesus answered her. And he says, "O woman, great is your faith." And it's in stark contrast to the faith of the religious leaders. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus had just come from debating with the religious leaders, and in the context of Matthew 15, it reads this way: there is absolutely nothing. Jesus can feed 5,000. He can walk on water. He can heal the demon-possessed people. He can open the eyes of the blind. He can hear the deaf. He can make the lame to walk. He can do all these things. And there is absolutely nothing that Jesus can do that will encourage the faith of the religious leaders. And it's as if there is nothing that Jesus can do that would discourage her faith. This is the strongest commendation of faith. And he found this treasure in the most unlikely of all places, the region of Tyre and Sidon, from a random Canaanite woman. Jesus had spoken truthfully in Matthew chapter 11, verses 21 and 22, and I can't help but as Matthew writes these words of Jesus that he is thinking of this woman. Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon. They would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes, but I say to you, it'll be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And here's this woman from the region of Tyre and Sidon. There was nothing that Jesus could do to make the religious leaders believe, and there was nothing that Jesus could do to make her not believe. Great faith, it turns out, has nothing to do with your knowledge. It has nothing to do with your ceremonial cleanliness. It has nothing to do with how much you offered to the temple or offered to the church every Sunday morning. It has absolutely nothing to do with how many worldly things you isolate from, but it has everything to do with unwavering faith in Jesus. And then Jesus affirms that he has heard her this whole time, and he says, let it be to you as you desire. Here's the crumb that you were asking for. She believed that a crumb of Jesus' grace could solve all of her problems. And the steak dinner that was prepared for Israel was rejected, and she welcomed the crumb. Jesus, this whole time, it turns out, did not despise her. He was not ignoring her. He was not racially slurring her, but he was waiting for her to make that beautiful declaration of unwavering faith, and then she had all of his attention. Jesus had gone way out of his way to find this treasure, to display it to the disciples, and it turns out it was well worth the trip, because immediately after this, he goes back to Galilee. So I wonder, as we think about our own life, how great is our faith this morning? Are you frustrated because it seems like there are certain prayers that are going unanswered, maybe for several years? Are you tired because you're not sure if God hears you? The purpose of this passage is that you would hope in God, that your unwavering faith would be in the God that you know hears and that you know can act. And like this Canaanite woman, we are all called to unwavering faith in the power, in the mercy, and in the character of God. That we would be the kind of people that there is absolutely nothing that this world could throw at us that would discourage our faith. That we would be the kind of people that Spurgeon put it this way, that would make the Lord of glory surrender to faith. Does your faith depend on Christ alone? Does your faith persist even though it is through silence? And does your faith declare the truth about God despite the circumstances that you face? And the question that we must all leave this morning and ask ourselves is, do we have the great faith like this Canaanite woman?